our house. This week, we are talking about how do we navigate all of the different voices that are competing for our children's attention when it comes to sex and sexuality, and being able to assess that, wow, we aren't the only voice speaking to them because they are finding stuff online, in TV, in the songs that they're hearing at school, with their cousins, with their friends. And so we want to take time this week. We're still in that session of like figuring out the home we have. Where are we at? Let's assess where we're at right now. And so we want to assess who's in your house. Who else is impacting your children's perspective on all things sexuality? And we know that in today's culture, things are constantly changing. It is really overwhelming to try to stay in touch with it when you're like, oh man, I had a pager when I grew up. I didn't have like this a device in my pocket and at my leisure whenever I wanted. And so being able to figure out how do we stay in touch with what is coming at our children. Last week's session with Danny was so good, and it ended. I love the question he kind of posed was your child. You want to be able to ask your child, "What do you need from me?" And hopefully, our child could be able to respond and also ask that at times. And when I was listening to that, I was thinking, oh man, this right here is probably something our child is never going to be able to verbalize and say, Mom and Dad, I need you to give me more boundaries on what I watch. Like, Mom and Dad, I need you to stop letting me listen to this. Like, this is probably something they're never going to actually verbalize and communicate. But I don't know about you, and hopefully you can spend some time in your homework this week to be able to assess what about when you were a kid? Because for me, I can think back to moments, scenarios, things that I'm like, wow, I wish I had boundaries around these things, that I didn't have access to it. Or I wish my parents knew that these were the lyrics I was hearing at like 12 years old so that they could be a voice and speak into it. But naturally, some of these things, when they're coming up to our kids, or I can remember from my own personal experience, the second you hear those bad words or that kind of like really sexualized song lyrics that their friends are singing to, or you saw something on TV, you're like, as a child, you're kind of like, ooh, no, I don't want to bring that up. That'd be weird. And so I remember thinking, man, I wish I had more trusted adult voices inside of my yard to say, "Oh, honey, that's not good," or "This is what why would they sing that?" And so that's what we want to do today is assess, wow, our kids need us to enter into this. We cannot just kind of stay in this like la la land of we don't know what's going on with our kids or what they're listening to, but how do you engage? How do you get there? Another thing Danny mentioned in his conversation that I thought was so powerful is he talked about how often when there's things that we're afraid of and or we're living in a little bit of fear around, we tend to go to shut down or control. And I think that is where this topic is that applies very, very well. Because when we think about, oh, it's overwhelming, I just want to shut down and avoid the whole topic. Like, I don't know, my kids are just watching Disney Channel, or I don't know, they're only listening to these radio station, songs that are on the radio, so it can't be that explicit or bad. We're just like shut down. Like they'll be okay. I figured it out, they'll figure it out. Or the heavy control where we're like no to everything, no devices, no, and you just try to shelter. And so we don't want to revert to that, right? We want to really figure out how can we engage? How can we ask our children the questions, and how can we really figure out what they're being exposed to? And so right now we're going to have a conversation really that I just want you to feel invited in and almost given permission to be like, no, you should be figuring this out. You can be like researching and looking into this, or watching a show randomly one night with your spouse because you're like, oh, these are the shows my kids are watching and I want to see what they're seeing. So I just want to give you that permission. Before we ran and were directing Moral Revolution, we were in youth ministry for over a decade. And so being a youth pastor for 10 years and doing that is diving in with these kids and learning what they're watching and listening to. And I remember thinking, oh, if only parents knew this is what's on Netflix. Like, you just kind of assume like, oh, if it's on TV, it's okay. But there's pornography on Netflix. There's such explicit messaging and sex scenes. So we want to know what our kids are learning subliminally and explicitly and be able to have a voice into that. So a couple examples that I also want to dive into from my own experience that, again, I invite you in your homework this week for you to dive into it, because I think then when we can find our own points, like touch points and ways we relate with our kids, and give those as examples in our conversation with them. For me, I remember a TV commercial at the time of, I'm trying to think, I was 14 years old. It influenced a major decision I made, but it was all subliminal, right? It's not like I actually knew, oh, I'm basing this off this commercial I saw. But in the moment, finding out my boyfriend cheated on me in freshman year in high school, and he's saying, stay with me. And I'm like, I don't know what to do right now. Like, I didn't want to lose the popular boyfriend I had. I'm just trying to make this quick decision. But what happened in my thoughts was a stinking Gatorade TV commercial where it was Mia Hamm and Michael Jordan. Some of you parents that are in my generation will remember this. And they were kind of taunting each other off and on the basketball court and the soccer field. And the song that was playing was Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better. That commercial is what made my decision as a young 14-year-old girl when my boyfriend's saying, stay with me, I won't do this again. And I'm looking for what would a powerful woman do? What does a woman say to this? And I didn't want to be some, just like lay down and take it woman, but I thought, oh, anything you can do, I can do better. That's what I'll do. And I made this subliminal decision from this commercial of how to live my life. And so when I think of that, and then when I think of the song lyrics I was singing of keep it on the down low, nobody has to know. That was the song that we would be bumping in our little, my 16-year-old self driving through town. But that's what I was doing. Keep it on the down low. Nobody has to know. One of the songs of our time was like all about booty calls. And I'm like, I thought I was so powerful because my pager was blowing up with booty calls. It was all about what I was listening to. It was about what my friends were saying. If you got to test drive the car before you buy it, you guys know, right? Me sharing my stories, you're probably like, oh yeah, I remember these moments and these things. But it's so crazy to think about the impact they have on a young little mind and a young brain when nobody else is speaking into these things. That's where we go. We go to, well, this is the way it is. And we end up mimicking the movies and living the lyrics. And so for our children, the lyrics are just getting more explicit, right? The movies are just getting more crazy and more sexualized. And then really our children are being sexualized at such a younger age. Okay, I want to jump in and give you some practical tools of how do we do this? What could this look like? I remember my first moments making these decisions to engage in this way when you're kind of like pioneering something and nobody's like told you, hey, there's no owner's manual of like, here's what you do with kids and how you engage in this. I remember just thinking, is this okay? Is this weird? Is this normal? But I know that I need to know what my kids are being exposed to. I need to know who's in my house because who they're listening to, what they're watching is impacting and influencing them subliminally or explicitly. So here's some tools on how to live proactively versus reactively when it comes to this. And then also we're going to have a second follow-up conversation where we're inviting in a youth pastor who's currently youth pastoring and also raising teenagers at the same time to be able to say, okay, what do you wish that parents knew now? How can they engage? How can they step into these conversations? And what do they need to know? Because we want to be able to create boundaries defining what is safe and healthy and what is not. And another part of it is realizing, you know what, when it comes to being a parent, it feels really tough and overwhelming. But for our children, it's even more overwhelming and it's even tougher and crazier to think about what they're navigating with what they're being seen. So we want to step into it with them. So, a couple practical examples of it's just if we were sitting down and having coffee right now, these are the conversations. These are the conversations I have with my friends. With I'm like, did you know? One of my friends actually just texted me one of these examples last week. So I'm going to step in and give you some of those conversations that maybe you're not having at coffee with your friends, and then some tools for how we can really engage with our children and some resources. So first of all is realizing the thing that's different with our generation and when we were raised versus what's happening now is children are being sexualized at a younger and younger age. In our home, we actually don't have like cable television. So I wasn't exposed, my children weren't exposed to like Nickelodeon and Disney, but I remember just last year being in the hospital with my daughter where they only have like the two kids channels, kind of like when you're a hospital or a hotel, the two different places, I guess, that were exposed to cable television. Nickelodeon was on, you're just looking for the one channel. It's a scary situation we're in, trying to get her to fall asleep at night. It's loud noises and beeping and all the things. So I'm like, okay, there's cartoons, here's Nickelodeon. So I put Nickelodeon on and I was in complete and utter shock with what I saw. It was a celebrity that I didn't even know existed. It's a famous celebrity's sibling, and but it was a very flamboyant man, young man, dressed with makeup and just I mean, just everything that I'm like, wow, I have to change the channel. I don't want my daughter to see this. Again, this is a reactive, not proactive situation. But it was my first time being introduced to the idea that, oh wow, maybe Nickelodeon's not safe. So realizing as parents that we have to be engaged enough to know that the things that when we were young, like I watched Nickelodeon, I think every day after school. I don't recall ever seeing something sexualized when I was a child watching Nickelodeon when I came from home from school. So realizing that things that we might kind of just put in this box of like that's kids stuff, so I don't even need to check that, is realizing it's really not that way anymore. I went then after seeing that and looked up this celebrity on Instagram because I'm like, what in the world? Who is this person? And then what I saw on Instagram, this person's Instagram was so explicit, so intense that I was like, man, it's so heartbreaking to think this is what kids are growing up being introduced to at such a young age, and that it's going to form so many concepts inside of them. And then the example from last week, my friend texting me, they were at a hotel and her children were watching a baking show on the Disney Channel. Again, something you're like, perfect, this is safe, my kids are okay, they're not gonna be flipping to HBO or something. They're watching a baking show. And then there was a very, very long conversation about pronouns, about kids saying, like, it's so fun to explore, and I've been able to figure out if I'm a he, him, or a she, her, or a them, they, and just explaining this very, very explicitly and for drawn out and really kind of drawing the kids in, where you're like, oh my word, I never would want my little 5-year old or my 11-year old to be able to see this and have to even think about these things that we know what we would speak to. So I say that to just say we can't just put these certain things in a box of thinking, oh, it's a cartoon, so it's clean. Oh, it's just Disney. There's so many actual entire series on Disney that I found out that I'm like completely uncomfortable with my children watching. I haven't figured out even fully how do we navigate? Do we just get rid of all of it? So those are the decisions that you make. But the whole point of this episode is for us to say, okay, who's in your house? What are your children watching? Do you know? Are you aware? Spend time when they're not with you engaging. If you have maybe just the Disney app, like the Disney Plus app, or you have just Netflix app, whatever you have, spend some time with you and your spouse alone with when your kids are in bed and go look through, or make sure you're sitting in an open area with your children. And maybe that's the boundary of, hey, we don't have screens behind closed doors, so we're all here seeing it together, so I can be able to jump in and speak to something. Or honestly, what happens now is also just commercials, right? You could be watching a sports game, you could be watching something completely innocent, but your kids could be bombarded with some advertisement that they're like, oh, this is so uncomfortable. So look at those things, engage there. Fast forwarding then to maybe high schoolers, because I remember then as being a youth pastor thinking, I need to know what our kids are watching. A thing came up on Netflix. And again, I think our generation, I just remember thinking, like, you don't see nudity on TV. Like, you'd have to, be purposeful to go to a certain HBO or Showtime or pay for something. Like, it wouldn't just pop up as nudity on TV. And Netflix is the new TV, right? And so I saw this show pop up and I'm like, it was definitely targeting high schoolers. I personally had no desire to watch it, but I'm like, man, all of our high schoolers are probably watching this. I'm going to go ahead and sit here this one night by myself and watch a couple episodes. And I was appalled. I mean, it was the worst pornographic type of things I've ever seen. There was full nudity, a full young man. I mean, it's supposed to be a high schooler's penis, butt, boobs. I mean, everything, full sex scenes, and so explicit. And then the messaging behind what was being taught in this like high school arena about sex education. I'm like, literally, there's probably thousands and thousands of teenagers watching this because it's called sex education and it's high schoolers, and they're thinking, this is where I can find out what my parents aren't talking to me about, or is what school is telling me the right thing. And so it's just insane to think what they'd be informed by with watching these shows. So again, this is just your permission to say, wow, I didn't even know that. I didn't know there could be full nudity in on Netflix. I didn't know that there were these things. It's just an invitation to say, wow, I need to jump in and engage. I want to watch what my kids are watching. I want to see what they're seeing. And maybe you're like, oh, my kids don't have access to that. But again, all of their peers are probably watching this. So it's a great thing to just be aware and be engaged, to be proactive instead of reactive in these moments. Another great example is music, right? My kids are still pretty young, so they have very strict boundaries around music. We're not into the high school where we have to kind of jump into like letting them listen to more things. So for those of you, depending on what age and stage you are with your children, one perfect example that I've heard of is saying, you know what, why don't we, when you hear your kid listening to a song or maybe it's coming on the radio, go find that song and print out the lyrics and like do it with your child. Like have a conversation with them where you're like, hey, let's print out the lyrics to what we're singing or what you're hearing. And what do you think about this? And like really teaching them to critically think about what they're being entertained by. The way that I like to say it that makes it really easy to remember and something you can reiterate with your children is that we are being trained by what we're entertained by. We're being trained by what we're entertained by because over time it's constant, right? It's constantly getting inside of us. And so teaching our children, man, I we don't line up with that. Why would we sing that, right? Like, oh wow, that's not okay. I don't like that. And so helping them discover that obviously as they're older on their own and creating those boundaries and that critical thinking skill of, oh wow, do I really believe this? Do I want to be singing this over and over? And then really being able to assess as parents first our level of desensitization, right? Because even now with different things with LGBTQ or a boy wearing makeup on TV or the new Cinderella has like a man playing the godmother. And I'm like, oh, for me now, right? I'm a little desensitized where I saw it didn't like stand out to me as much. But what's funny is it popped up as an ad on my TV and my son was like, turn it off. Like that boy has on lipstick. Turn it off. He's wearing a dress. And I was like, wow, they haven't been as desensitized, right? And we want to protect that and celebrate that. And so assessing your own level to be able to be like, oh, wow, and making sure that we can protect and help and guide our kids to not reach that point as well. Okay, next up is social media, y'all. So, again, we're in different ages and stages in our parenting, but you have to engage. My kids don't have it yet. I have young kids, but as a youth pastor, I could not implore you enough to figure out what your kids have and be in it with them. Again, as parents, we didn't have this growing up, so we do not understand firsthand experience of what it would be like as a young teenager with this constant access, with all of these things coming at us. So, a couple things I just want to encourage you on, and then I'm going to give you more resources here at the end. We know Facebook. Probably all of us are on Facebook. Our kids are not on Facebook. They don't care about Facebook. They would say Facebook's for grandparents. Then there's Instagram. Instagram is amazing. I think most of us probably watching our generation, we're on Instagram. We like Instagram. I don't see anything nasty on Instagram because I see my friends. I see home decor. It feeds you what you want to see. But you guys, I need you to know that number one, there is pornography all over Instagram. There are extremely explicit things. There are predators on Instagram. There's things like this that, again, these aren't constant conversations we're having at coffee with our friends, but it's very real. There's so many stories of teenagers saying like they were introduced and became addicted to pornography because of Instagram. And most parents were just not aware of that because we have our own Instagram and we know how we use it and what we see on it. So we wouldn't be aware. So you need to be aware that's a possibility. It's a probability. There's ways of sending photos on Instagram that then they delete. They don't live there forever. So that it's not like oh, I have my child's password. I can see what they see, but there's things that go away. Again, these are just really simple things to be aware of so that you can engage, so that you can jump into it with them and know what your child is really just having access to and what's having access to them so that we can engage with them in that conversation. Then we can jump to Snapchat, TikTok. I mean, I literally just got a TikTok like 2 days ago. I was resisting forever. I don't think I'm going to use it. I got it because I needed to see something that was being said. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a whole new world. And I remember thinking, oh, as a youth pastor, I would have gotten TikTok a long time ago. So as parents, I mean, it's ever changing. You're like, at what point do I just like give up? But we can't give up when we have to understand our kids are literally living inside of this world. Like it is forming their entire opinions and the things that are coming at them. So we've got to figure out at some point to jump in and be able to access it. Maybe it's with them, maybe it's on our own so we can see what they're seeing. It's up to you again having these conversations, but jumping in to realize it. The thing about Snapchat that I hope that you guys can learn, and I'm going to tell you some more resources so you can dig into it because it's its whole own episode if you jump into Snapchat. Not only is it things that disappear, their money can be exchanged, but also is their explore page or what comes at them is, I mean, there's just so many messages that you would be so alarmed by if you saw what they were being told about anything from abortion to porn, to masturbation. I mean, just coming at them in real time. So these are things, again, if we were having coffee, I'd be letting you know if you had a teenager that has Snapchat. There's also hidden apps that there's just sneaky things that us parents that I'm like, I feel like a grandma when I get on my phone sometimes. I'm like, I can't figure this out. I have to constantly ask people for help. But so I understand how challenging this can be. But there are hidden apps that even look like a calculator, that then have this whole other world behind them. So if you just were like, oh, I look at my kid's phone every night, and you're like, oh, I didn't know there could be a hidden app. Again, just an open door for you to be able to explore, have these conversations with your kids, and do some research. One more thing is to think about the sex education that's happening at your kid's school, right? Because when we ask who's in your house, what's affecting your kid's sexuality, whether they go to a Christian school or a public school, figuring out what is it that my children are being taught, who is teaching them, what are the conversations they're having. You have full permission as a parent to go to your children's school and ask to be able to have access to everything that they will be taught. And then obviously have a conversation with your kids about it. There's going to be certain times where you're going to maybe want to pull your kid out from that scenario. But there's other times that you might say, you know what, we're going to leave them in, and we're going to make sure that then we can have the follow-up. We prepare them maybe the night before or 2 days before, and then we have a follow-up conversation with how did that feel in class? What was that like? What were your friends saying? So really just making sure that you're also engaging there. Okay, I know that this could feel very intimidating or overwhelming when you're thinking about all the things. You probably have big eyes, like, never heard that before, didn't have an idea of that. And here's the thing, like I said, as a former youth pastor, awareness is key, is so that you are so aware and able to ask questions. Now, we're going to get into it in the future weeks about how to foster connection, because connection is so important before we even think about correction in some of these things. Our kids just need to know that we are there for them. We are in it with them, that we want to help them, that we want to talk about all of the things. And so we will get there. So some of this in your homework is going to be you assessing, wow, didn't know about this. I'm going to investigate. And that's what we really encourage right now, is for you to investigate it, you to get kind of your grip on, oh, wow, what are my kids listening to? What are they watching? What are their peers saying based on what you know? And then as we grow and build the connection, you're going to be able to create that culture inside of your home to where you're not going to feel like an investigator in your kid's heart, where you're like, what is this? What is this? What is this? You have connection where they feel safe bringing these things up to you. Or you could say, wow, did you hear what that lyric just said? So again, we're kind of giving you that behind the scenes work right now as the parent to start getting engaged and realizing what voices are speaking into your child's hearts and minds when it comes to these topics. A couple more tools before we get to part 2 with our youth pastor friend. These are a couple of resources and friends and partners in ministry that have amazing tools for you parents that we will do future hot topic videos with and all of the things. The first one is axis.org. Again, if we were having coffee, I would be like pulling it up on my phone, showing it to you, say, go check this out, because axis.org exists for parents like us raising kids in this culture. They have a free email every Friday called the Cultural Translator. When you get this email, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, thank you for doing the work for me, because they basically assess some current events that are hot topics that are about things that you're like, what even is that? They're talking about recording artists like Billie Eilish. I don't even know how to say her name right. They give you topics like, what does that emoji mean when your kid's saying it? And you're like, oh, I just thought it was a peach or an eggplant. Nope, not that. So they're going to break those things down for you in a weekly format where you're like, thank you for telling me that. Thank you that I can read my child's text message and actually accurately understand it now. So that's a free, amazing resource. But then what else they do, you can go explore their website. They have so many resources, something called conversation kits, where there will be a hot topic that, again, we cover so much, but it might be on something like Fortnite. So maybe you're in that younger boy stage where they're obsessed with Fortnite. You're like, what should I know about Fortnite? They do all the research, break it down, and then give you questions to ask your child. They have other things on what this new Netflix series that kids are watching, and a review on this show, and they break it down. So there's so many things like that that you're like, wow, this is amazing. I don't have to go watch a whole series of this television show that my kids are talking about. I can read this review of it from a Christian parent's perspective, and understand more. And then one other resource I want to tell you about is called Protect Young Eyes. It's an app. The founder, Chris McKenna, is based in Michigan, friends of ours, and he has created an entire, it's like 500 mini lessons in your pocket on all of these things. On instead of just saying the internet is a scary space, okay, so what are some solutions for how we can make it safer for our children? So Protect Young Eyes, we'll have more from Chris with us too. But we hope that this session, this part one of Who's in Your House, has opened your eyes, made you aware, given you permission to say, wow, I need to step into some of these things. I can't live in la la naive land. I need to engage in this with my children, assess what's in my house, what's spoken to them from this point on. And then I want to be able to be a part of these conversations as I foster connection and community inside of my house so well that our environment feels so safe that they can talk to us about all of these things. So we'll see you for part 2 with the youth pastor telling you all of the things they wish you knew.